Okay guys, so in this lesson we are going to look at bus processing, and if you're not sure what that is, go back and look at the lesson about bus processing where I explain the benefits of it and why it's useful. But look at the mixing process in this way. Imagine that we were a sculptor. We start off with a block of stone, and by the end we want to end up with this perfectly polished masterpiece. Now, in each stage of the process of carving this sculpture, the moves get smaller. So at first, when you've got that big block of stone, you're taking your big chunks, you're getting the rough shape of what you want. And this would be the music production stage where you're choosing sounds, you're making big changes to the synthesizers and whatnot, and you're getting it how you want to sound. The mixing process is refining that. The mastering process is kind of like the polish. So as we move down this chain of processes, the moves that we make to the audio should get smaller and smaller. And that is the same with this bus processing stage. So this is kind of adding the polish to the mix down that we've already done. And if you're having to make big moves with EQ and saturation and whatnot here, you've probably gone wrong somewhere a bit earlier in the chain, and it might be worth considering whether that's worth a revisit. That being said, you might have a really good creative reason for making a big move at this point in the mix, but generally speaking, they're going to be getting smaller and smaller. So with that in mind, let's see what buses we have on the go. Well, as we know, we've already got the drums bus, which is basically all of the drum sounds into a group in Ableton. So that counts as a bus. We've got a kick and the bass bus, and that's where I route both the kick and the bass just to that bus. I then routed the kick and the bass and the drum bus into an all drums bus, and I'll explain why I've done this right now actually. So with the drums here, the beauty of bus processing is that you can add these fine polish moves onto all of the sounds to really gel them together without processing the whole mix on the master channel and running the risk of crushing it or doing some weird EQ stuff that doesn't work for all the elements. So let's listen to the drums and see what's happened. First, I'll turn off the bus processing. This high pass filter and this reverb are actually automated, and we'll go into why I've done that in the dynamic mix lesson in a couple of lessons time, so bear with me on that. But for the time being, let's look at the processing we've got here. So this is with no bus processing on, just the drums. Sounds nice, but we're going to have a play and try and make that stick together a bit more. So what I've added here is a saturator, just to add a bit of fatness to it. It's very subtle, remember, at this stage. And then I've added the OTT multiband compression preset, which is just a really extreme multiband compressor. This was set up by Steve Duda, the guy that made Serum and X for LFO, and indeed X for Records. So I've actually got this in parallel, and we're going to be going into more parallel processing in the next lesson. But we can see that I've just added a small amount of this, so this is fully dry. And as I add this OTT multiband compressor, listen to that extra energy that it's given those drums. So that's with no effects on the drums bus. And that's with our new effects on the drums bus. And you can see by carefully adding these bus effects throughout your mix in very specific places, the overall mix at the end is just a lot fatter. It's got a lot more power and punch, and this made a huge difference to me personally with my mixes. I always wondered, oh, why do they sound so thin when I've done all of this processing on the single channels? Why do they still not sound as fat or as wide as my favorite producers? This was a big part of it. Okay, so the next very important bus processing is the kick and the bass, and this is because the relationship in the low end is so important. So that kick and bass have to gel together. Now don't get me wrong, you have to pick the correct kick sound, you have to make the correct bass sound when it comes to sound design. Remember the analogy about the sculptor, and get something that works very well together before we're polishing it. This is with no bus processing on the kick and the bass. They're simply routed to the same bus. So they already sound lovely and fat together. We've got a little bit of sidechain compression on the bass already, just to make it bounce with the kick. So let's add some effects. So here we've got a decapitator, and I'm just adding a tiny bit of saturation. And I've added a utility afterwards just to bring down the level, so it's gain staging, just so we can give it a fair test. Without and with. Now this is very subtle, but it just makes the kick and the bass a bit fatter, just gels it together, makes it sound as one whole. And I've added a little bit of glue compression afterwards as well with the makeup gain, to make sure it's a fair test. Again, just to make it really gel. Now when I said small moves, I'm talking about, 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction when it comes to the bus processing. If you push it too hard, you're going to kill the dynamics, and this is going to make your mix sound washed out and flat, and it's going to lose the punch that you've worked so hard to get. And then when I've processed the kick and the bass and the drums, you can then put them into an all drums bus. Now you could, if you really wanted, you could add a tiny bit of saturation here, just to again gel the kick and the bass with the rest of the drums, or a tiny bit of glue compression. But now, because we're one step further down the chain of bus processing, we're talking even less gain reduction, we're talking less effects that we want to put on, because all of this is cumulative, of course, and we're reducing the dynamics with every stage. I'm going to leave it because these sound great to me, but if you're not sure about it, feel free to try and then do an A/B comparison. So we might just notch, no more than a decibel, maybe half a dB, and then makeup gain to the same. To me that adds nothing, so I'm going to leave it off because I still want the transients to breathe through. And the way I usually bus process my mixes is I will have, as I've said, the drums on a bus, the kick and the bass to a bus. I'll then route them both together. I'll then have all the vocals on a bus, and I'll have all the rest of the instruments on a bus as well sometimes. And the reason I do this is so I can allow the vocals to breathe through and not compress them with everything else in the mix. Now I haven't bussed all of the other instruments together in this mix because I didn't feel it needed it. So we've got the main vocals bus, we've got the kick and the bass which routes into all drums, so that means that's the kick, the bass and the drums here. Vocals. And then all the other instruments going into the master fader. Again, this is a great place for saturation, a little bit of parallel processing with a bit of multi-band compression like the OTT, and perhaps even a little bit of additive EQ over a bus, something analog like the Waves VEQ4 for instance, rather than something really digital and clean like the Pro Q2. In the next lesson we are going to look at parallel processing, which is really, I guess you could say, this is the final polish for getting the maximum fatness, the maximum loudness. And then I'm going to show you about the dynamic mix that I mentioned and how to export all of this ready for the mastering stage so it can get on the radio and get out there. So I will see you in the next lesson.